it is the greatest circus act of our time. They did things that I doubt will ever be repeated.
The seven of us relying on each other, and if anybody makes a wrong move, it can cause all of us to fall.
They can overcome any kind of danger, even though their family has been killed doing this. They can still go up there and do that.
The show has to go on because this is not a game we're playing. This is our life, and life does not end.
Fly through the air. They ride like the wind. They make people laugh and gasp with amazement. For almost 5,000 years, circus performers have risked their lives to thrill audiences. But these aren't the fictional heroes of television and movies. These are the people who perform death-defying feats right before our eyes. And sometimes they die right before our eyes.
Take this one and that end ring on the far end.
They've unloaded their trucks, set up their platforms, and tested their rigging hundreds of times before in venues all over the world. But for the Wallendas, the most celebrated name in circus history, Detroit's Shrine Circus will be unlike any other.
I just want it so it's barely off the ground.
In less than 4 days, Tino and his sister Delilah will lead the next generation of Wallendas across a high wire strung 30 feet above the ground. They will attempt to duplicate a trick their family has not performed in front of an audience in 35 years. On January 30th, 1962, in this very arena, the great Wallendas were at the peak of their popularity. Their success was created by the family's unrivaled trademark, the 7-person pyramid. Performed without a safety net, it balanced 7 individual performers in 3 precarious layers, 30 feet above the ground. But on this night, only a few steps from safety, one of the performers suddenly shuddered under the weight. A perfection of acrobatic engineering came crashing down.
When it collapsed in Detroit, that was a real eye-opener for everybody, public as well as performers, because they never thought that it would ever happen. And public were finally aware of how dangerous circus work is. 2 dead and 1 in a wheelchair for life.
Despite the tragedy, the Wallendas never stopped performing. But the 7-person pyramid was dropped from their show.
Okay, let it in.
To bring it back in 1998, this young troupe will have to overcome something their ancestors never had to face. Ghosts from the past.
I had a couple friends as I was leaving. Of course, they were girls, but they started crying because they didn't want me to go, because they know the history and what's happened here in the past. And it scares them because we're doing the exact same thing.
We're going back to Detroit because the Wallendas have never done it back in Detroit yet. And I feel that we need to close the door on that part of our past.
For the Wallendas, the past is not a place of tragedy, but one of triumph. Germany, 1905. Karl Wallenda was born into every child's fantasy, a circus family of jugglers, aerialists, and animal trainers. His father was a trapeze artist, his mother a wire walker. But while the circus was a favorite form of entertainment, it was hardly a fantasy life. Hundreds of shows crisscrossed Europe. When war broke out, performers struggled to survive.
My grandfather was a hand balancer, and he would have to go into the bars and things at night and do his hand balancing act on tables and collect coins and change and bread and sometimes food and things from the people. He'd take it home. He supported his family. In the daytime, he worked in the coal mines.
In 1921, Karl's destiny began to unfold. He traveled miles to answer an ad for a hand balancer in the Louis Weitzman troupe. But once there, he got the shock of his life. Weitzman wanted him to do a handstand on Louis's feet, perched 3 stories above the ground.
He said, "No, you're nuts. I'm not going to do that." And he didn't have enough money to buy the train fare back home again, so he had to do it.
Suddenly, Karl was risking his life on a braided steel cord 1 inch in diameter, known to circus performers everywhere as the high wire. Under the critical eye of Weitzman, Karl mastered the art, including long, breathtaking excursions over open streets filled with disbelieving faces. With each death-defying act, Karl slowly succumbed to a lifelong addiction, the love of an audience.
At that very young age, he liked the applause. Karl loved the applause. From its very beginning, the high wire repaid Karl for the risks that he took.
After 2 years with Weitzman, Karl returned home. Barely out of his teens, he took control of his family and put its future on the high wire. Along with trapeze and animal acts, wire walking was one of the circus's biggest draws. Karl's imagination pushed the art into daring new territory. He devised fantastic human pyramids stacked 3 layers high. In 1927, 16-year-old Helen Kreis became what's known as the pretty girl on top, complementing Karl's powerful charisma below. Along with brother Herman and friend Joe Geiger, Karl created the Wallenda Famous Four, and together they took Europe by storm. In 1927, Karl and his troupe arrived in Havana, Cuba to perform for the Santos y Artigas circus. John Ringling, the American who'd created the biggest and most famous circus in the world, had made a special trip from New York just to scout them. The Cuban circus owner, fearing he would lose his prized act, immediately gave the Wallendas the day off. But Ringling wouldn't be fooled. He returned unexpectedly, took one look at the Wallendas' daring act, and signed them into circus history.
It's probably the single most important event in the history of the family. Otherwise, they would have been back in Germany starving, and who knows how long it would have been before Ringling would have found them.
New York, 1928. The Wallendas took their first bite from America's Big Apple. They spoke no English, yet knew this strange, energetic country would be their new home, and its people their audience. Madison Square Garden, April 5th. The Wallendas joined the greatest show on earth and were greeted by extravagance they had never experienced before. 2,000 animals, 800 performers, all working in 3 rings simultaneously, and all under one roof. As the Wallendas moved out onto the wire, the American crowd became silent and still. They had seen high wire acts, but never 3 layers of humanity teetering 60 feet above the ground. But what pushed them to the very edges of their seats was something they couldn't see at all.
Opening night, one of the pieces of equipment that didn't show up was the safety net. Because the net wasn't there, my grandfather chose to go ahead, as well the rest of the troupe, and perform without the net.
From the audience perspective, it's more thrilling. But from our perspective, you could be killed just as easily in a net as without a net.
In eerie silence, they took their final steps. The Wallendas were hit with a barrage of shouting and foot stomping, raw emotion they didn't understand.
They didn't know what was going on. They thought they were being booed. They were very upset, ready to pack their stuff and go back to Germany. The show could not go back on because the audience wouldn't stop until the Wallendas came back into the ring, and then the audience calmed down, and then the show resumed. It's the only time in the history of the big show that happened.
The Wallendas barnstormed through America and into what seemed like a bright future. Yet just beneath their daring exploits lurked tragedy. In 1936, Karl had saved enough money to buy a modest house in Sarasota, Florida. 3 generations of Wallendas have called it home ever since. But while other backyards are filled with barbecues and swing sets, the Wallendas are filled with steel wire and imagination. Karl's grandchildren, Tino and Delilah, live right next door to each other. Practice is at 4 p.m. sharp every day. For months, they have been practicing Karl Wallenda's aerial masterpiece, the 7-person pyramid.
In, go.
In just 3 days, the Wallendas will leave for the Shrine Circus in Detroit, where they will perform the 7 in public for the first time in 35 years.
Ready. All the way out. Go.
No one talks about the 1962 fall, although it is as much a part of their lives as the wire they walk. Karl's daughter, Jenny, lost her husband that night. Karl's son, Mario, was paralyzed. Today, along with their Uncle Arthur, they can only watch as a new generation risks their lives in pursuit of glory as the greatest high-wire act the world has ever seen. For those who have been there, experienced that glory, and paid a terrible price, there is concern.
Your wire still is not tight enough. Even on Dutch Road, the distance over here, you can go down there. Doing it on a 10-foot wire and doing it on 30 feet, I mean, that's a whole different ball game. You get up high and you look over there, uh-oh. When you look way down there, it's not the same.
New to the Wallendas are Sasha, a veteran of the Russian circus, and Tony, who first walked the wire just 2 years ago. At 19, Karl's great-grandson, Nicholas, is the youngest member of the 7. Alida, Karl's great-granddaughter, will become the first woman to work in a lower tier of the 7 and support the weight of the top mounter.
Father, we're just thankful today for your mercy, your grace. We're thankful for the talents you've given us. We're thankful for this opportunity that we've had in Detroit.
P.T. Barnum would go nuts over something like this. The Wallendas, not the Guacamole Brothers, the Wallendas are going to recreate the feat that collapsed in Detroit 36 years ago. It's the greatest promotional stunt anybody could ever pull. I hope they have their guns ready and they know what they're doing there. I hope so.
As the world fought the Depression of the early 30s, the Wallendas considered themselves lucky. Their 4-person troupe was making $160 a week, and their jobs were anything but boring. But circus work would never bring the Wallendas wealth. Instead, it brought them something more valuable: applause, fame, and the thrill of cheating death night after night. But the Wallendas' daring came with a tragic price. In 1936, Karl's younger brother Willie fell from the wire during a show in Denmark. 2 days later, he died. 1 year later in Schenectady, New York, their rigging collapsed in mid-performance, and the Wallenda Famous Four came tumbling down. While no one was seriously hurt, they earned a satiric nickname they would never lose: the Flying Wallendas. But tragedy and misfortune would not stop the Wallendas, and neither would the risk.
You know, we always had fear, that we always think, believing that something can happen. Every time I say my prayers, quietly, you know, before I go on the wire, because you never know what's happened.
They can look at the Wallendas on the high wire and say, look at these guys, man. They can overcome any kind of danger. They can overcome, even though their family has been killed doing this, they can still go up there and do that. Well, I can go home and mow the lawn now.
While the edge was where Karl wanted to be, he never felt his audience wanted him to fall. After all, his job was to defy death. In 1935, Karl married his aerial sweetheart, Helen, and a year later, another Wallenda arrived, destined for the high wire.
My mother always had great ideas, like me going to finishing school, and ballet lessons, and piano lessons, and I didn't care for any of it. Back in those days, I'd say, I don't need an education. Why do I need to read or write? I can walk a wire.
After nearly 2 decades of unparalleled success, World War II upstaged the Wallendas. When the war was over, circus crowds were smaller, tents were folding. But soon, an idea would come to Karl that would change high wire history forever.
Mom, don't forget to bring the dog balls.
When the Wallendas hit the road, they don't leave home. They take it with them. It's Friday morning in Sarasota, Florida, a long 3-day drive from the state fairgrounds in Detroit. Karl's granddaughter, Delilah, and her family will leave first, followed by Karl's grandson, Tino, and his family. Each one has much to do and much to think about. 1 week from today, they will be dressed in bright costumes, listening to the ringmaster introduce them to the sold-out Shrine Circus crowd. After that, there will be no turning back.
Liana, did you see this?
What?
It has Mario in here. It's quoting, I think they're all crazy. I think he's right.
In the late 40s, the Wallendas embarked on a journey of a different kind. Karl left Ringling Brothers and began a circus of his own. To headline such a grand endeavor, he needed the greatest act the world had ever seen. In a single leap, Karl scrapped the 4-person pyramid and built one with 7. 4 performers would stand on the wire connected by 2 bars, which would support 2 more performers connected by a 3rd bar. The top mounter would sit in a chair balanced on the top bar. The showstopper came when she put her feet on the seat of the chair and slowly stood up.
It was dangerous simply because with so many people involved, each one of them making little moves on his own affected the balance of the others on the wire.
Karl placed the strongest performers on the bottom. Each had to support more than 200 pounds while trying to manage a 30-pound balance pull. On the second level, Karl and his brother Herman had to balance on bars moving forward and side to side. They supported the weight and movement of the top mounter above. The most difficult part came when the pretty girl stood up, sending tremors through the entire pyramid.
You have to work absolutely together. You don't think about anything like this, but just hold. Hold and hold and hold, and don't do anything else. Don't think about a movie going tonight. What am I going to do tomorrow? Play a game of golf or something? No, no. You concentrate on exactly what you're doing.
The Wallendas' new invention was quickly criticized as too dangerous.
Even the wire performers themselves, other wire acting performers, they're crazy.
April 1947. The 7-person pyramid made its debut.
There was that tense moment that people watched the pyramid build, and that tension built so high that by the time it was completed, they would just explode with it.
The 7, as it came to be called, was a sensation. It gave Karl and the Wallendas what they craved, an explosion of applause like they'd never heard. For a while, they even practiced a version with 8 people, but it can only be seen in this home movie because even Karl knew it was too dangerous. He never performed it in public. While the 7-person pyramid was a rousing success, the Wallenda Circus was not. Poor marketing closed it down after just 1 year. The Wallendas went back to working in other circuses. But the 7-person pyramid was now the unmatched centerpiece of the Wallenda show. It was assured of a long run because Karl had a steady and trusted source of performers right in his own family. Jenny, his daughter from a previous marriage, his adopted son Mario, and his daughter Carla all learned to walk the wire almost before they could walk on the ground.
We nicknamed him Simon Legree, the old-time slave driver. But I mean, no regret. He never was mean in it or anything like that. And I guess like in any athletics or Olympics, he was our coach. And the coaches have to be the ones that push, right?
Guy, forgive me, that's why we used to sometimes call him God. Because there was the right way, the wrong way, and Karl Wallenda's way, and he did it Karl Wallenda's way.
But even Karl couldn't hold everyone in the 7 forever. In 1956, at age 53, his younger brother Arthur discovered he'd lost his nerve and quit.
He says, what are you, a performer or a farmer? I said, look, I'd rather be a live farmer than a dead performer.
Just months later, after 30 years and thousands of performances, Karl's wife Helen decided she too had lost her courage.
I think Helen was always afraid of the act. I think she was afraid every performance. She conquered that fear, which is to conquer the fear. This could be maybe tougher than doing the act itself.
In 1956, she quit the act. Once grounded, she couldn't even bear to watch.
I know the music, and when I hear the finale, I just say, thank God they came down again once more, sound and safely.
Time would prove their fears were real. In 1958, Gunther Wallenda's wife, Margarita, fell from the wire in Mexico City. She died from her injuries. Moments after the accident, the crowd was stunned when the rest of the Wallendas climbed skyward. They obeyed the first commandment of circuses everywhere. The show must go on.
I asked Gunther once, Gunther Wallenda, about that, and his remark was, well, the show must go on because they've sold tickets. And if the show doesn't go on, where does it go? So,
truck stop here.
The one thing the Wallendas won't do this trip is get lost. From Sarasota, Florida to Detroit, Michigan is one long straight shot up Interstate 70. Dead ahead, can't miss it. With practice behind them and Detroit more than 1,000 miles ahead, the Wallendas hardly seemed like a group on a dangerous mission. While the fall in 1962 can't be ignored, this generation is determined to enjoy the adventure and create its own destiny.
Sad time in history, but to sit and worry about what might happen, that's like losing a family member to a car accident and then never driving again because you're too worried what might happen.
When the Wallendas arrived in Detroit in 1962, they were royalty, and the circus was their kingdom. But while preparing for their Shrine Circus performance, Jenny Wallenda had a sudden and disturbing premonition.
I had a nightmare and I saw the whole 7 come down, and I woke up in the morning and I was crying and crying.
Even though a more experienced performer was available, Karl put his nephew Dieter Schepp into the show. It was only the second time Dieter had performed the 7 in public. During practice, Jenny noticed Dieter was holding his 30-pound pole dangerously low.
I noticed he had the hands way down, so I yelled at him. I said, Dieter, you can't do that. If you do that in the 7, they're all going to come down.
On the night of January 30th, 1962, Dieter led the troupe onto the wire. He complained of a cold, but told Karl he didn't want to come out of the show. Up above was his sister Jana, who was performing the top mount for the very first time. Only a few steps from safety, Dieter's arms dropped.
I say Dieter's hand. I see the hand is way down again. And you can't imagine how you feel. What are you going to do? Yell? Then they're all fall. Not yell, they're all fall. What are you going to, I mean, it went so fast.
Suddenly, Dieter cried out, "I can't hold it any longer." He began to shake, sending a deadly shockwave through the wire. Below, animal trainer John Harriet had just finished his act and was talking with another performer.
He said to me, "My God, they're falling down." And I turned around and there they came down.
The Wallendas were an avalanche of balance poles and sequined costumes. Dieter, Dick Fawn, and Mario all plummeted 33 feet to the sawdust floor below.
We all ran to the ring. The bodies were laying there. We didn't know who was dead or who was alive, and I didn't know what to do. But I know that Karl was up there with Herman. They were holding the girl, and she was screaming.
Karl had managed to catch the wire in one hand and his niece Jenna in the other. Herman also caught the wire, and together they held Jenna from certain death.
They were yelling, "Get a net, get a net, get a..." There was no net.
Finally, they found a tumbling mat and held it beneath the wire.
Karl's yelling to her, "Let go, let go." No, she's screaming, she's terrified. Finally, he just pushed her away. He had to, as she's pulling him and Herman off the wire.
Jenna dropped into the mat and escaped with only bruises. Meanwhile, Jenny could only watch as her husband was carried from the ring.
And then I finally got to the hospital. I was in the waiting room. They wouldn't let me go to my husband. They wouldn't let me see my husband. And then a newspaper man came in, and he said, "Where's this woman who's from the high wire whose husband just died?" And I jumped up, and I know I attacked the man, and Günther told me later on I really attacked him bad, because, you know, that's a horrible way to find out that your husband died.
Also dead was Dieter, the young performer whose inexperience finally brought the Wallenda 7-person pyramid to earth.
Other people might tell you that he should never have been there in the first place, that it was wrong of Karl to put him there. I don't know. And I don't know if anybody really knows.
For the first time, the family's faith in Karl was shaken. The man they had followed without question had led them into disaster. 7 years later, Karl showed no remorse.
He could get a heart attack. We don't know what happened that time. And I'm not feeling guilty about this.
I hated at that time my dad, and I told him so. I mean, it's like, I actually feel like he killed him.